It began at 10:23 a.m., a pulse on a radar screen. Aboard the USS Lexington, a young radar operator named Ensign James Cox leaned into his headset, eyes fixed on the glowing arc. The contact was faint, distant, 120 miles northwest, but growing stronger by the second. Multiple bogies inbound, bearing 270, range 120 miles, altitude 20,000 feet. Within minutes, the entire Task Force 58 was on alert. On the carrier decks, flight crews sprinted through the heat, pulling chocks, loading ammunition, fueling tanks. The Pacific sun glared off the rows of parked aircraft, 220 F6F Hellcats, wings folded like sleeping predators. Below deck, the Combat Information Center came alive. Voices, bearings, and numbers colliding in organized chaos. Admiral Mark Mitcher, calm as ice, gave the order that would define the battle. Launch everything we've got. Let's turn them back before they ever see the fleet. The hatch doors opened. One after another, the Hellcats roared down the deck, engines screaming, wings snapping open, tails lifting into the blue. Within minutes, the sky above the carriers turned into a spiral of ascending fighters. The climb rate of the F6F, 12,000 feet per minute, made it seem like they were climbing into the sun itself. To the north, 450 Japanese aircraft were inbound, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. The cream of Japan's remaining naval air power, launched from Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the last of the Imperial Navy's great carriers. For the Japanese pilots, this was redemption. The humiliation of the marshals, the loss of Truk, the retreat from Rabaul, all of it led here. They had trained for months, rehearsing strikes against mock carrier formations. They believed that the old tactics would still work, that the samurai spirit, even outnumbered, could break the American machine. But they never saw what was waiting for them. Radar had already plotted their exact altitude, bearing, and closure rate. In the combat information centers aboard the U.S. carriers, controllers spoke into radios with mathematical calm. Hellcat Group Baker, Vector 310, Angels 20, bogies approaching, intercept in 5 minutes. Each vector was invisible precision, a digital ambush before digital even existed. The Hellcats reached 20,000 feet and spread out in pairs. Sunlight caught their navy blue fuselages as they leveled off into attack position. Below them, the Japanese formation glimmered, neat, tight, and utterly unaware. Lieutenant Alex Vrashu, a pilot from the USS Lexington, throttled forward. His radar intercept officer's voice came through the headset. "You're on top of them. 3 miles, no evasive." The first Hellcats dove. The 50 caliber guns thundered. 6 streams of tracers tore through the sky, and in seconds the formation below disintegrated. Within 15 minutes, the American fighters tore through the Japanese vanguard like saw blades through paper. Pilots reported multiple kills within seconds of contact. Vrashu alone destroyed 6 dive bombers in 8 minutes, 1 every 80 seconds. Below, carrier groups watched as burning planes fell like comets into the sea. The sailors began to cheer, even as the sky shimmered with black smoke trails and falling debris. It was not a battle. It was an equation. Radar vectoring plus altitude advantage, plus industrial-scale training equals annihilation. By sunset, 373 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The Americans lost 29. The pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name would stick forever. From that day, the Zero's legend, from the myth of invincible agility, was over. The hunter of 1942 had become prey by 1944. And the Hellcat, the Grumman Ironworks cat, had proven that in modern war, the machine that sees first wins first. The Japanese pilots never stood a chance. They were fighting radar, mathematics, and mass production. By nightfall, Task Force 58 had rewritten the rules of aerial combat and buried the last generation of Japan's elite aviators in the blue grave of the Philippine Sea. The age of the Zero was over. The age of systems had begun. For 2 years, the A6M-0 had been a ghost, fast, weightless, and untouchable. It was the first aircraft that made Allied pilots afraid to climb into the sky. In 1942, the Zero ruled everything from Ceylon to Hawaii. It shredded British Hurricanes over Burma, burned Dutch Buffaloes out of Java, and turned American Wildcats into wreckage over the Coral Sea. Its kill ratio, 12-1 in the opening months of the war, made it a symbol of Japanese invincibility. To Allied pilots, it seemed supernatural. It could climb vertically, turn inside any opponent, and dance on the edge of a stall. Its range went over 1,900 miles, meant it could appear where no one expected it. The Americans nicknamed it the long arm of the Emperor, even when the Allies captured a crashed Zero in 1942, the famous Akutan Zero, and dissected it in California. Disbelief remained. Pilots still swore it defied physics. But every miracle hides a flaw. The Zero's secret wasn't magic. It was compromise, speed and agility purchased by stripping away everything else. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no bulletproof glass, no redundancy in controls. It was a flying sword, beautiful, fast, and fatally fragile. In 1942, that didn't matter. The Japanese pilots who flew them, men like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Tetsuzo Iwamoto, were the best-trained aviators on Earth. They were veterans of China, masters of energy fighting, and products of a ruthless training system that washed out 90% of its candidates. Each one was an artist with a joystick. And against the inexperienced Americans of 1941 to 42, men trained in peacetime complacency, flying underpowered planes, the Zero was untouchable. It embodied the Bushido ideal: one warrior, one kill, one moment of perfection. The Zero wasn't designed for attrition, it was designed for purity, the aerial equivalent of a samurai duel. But war isn't a duel, it's a production line. By 1943, the cracks were showing. Japan's aircraft plants were being bombed. Its oil supply was shrinking. And most dangerously, its flight schools couldn't replace the dead. For every ace killed at Guadalcanal, there was no replacement. The Imperial Navy shortened training hours, cut tactics courses, and sent green pilots straight to the front. By the time of the Marianas campaign, Japanese carrier air groups were filled with men who had 100 flight hours, barely enough to take off and land. Meanwhile, the Americans had turned air combat into a science. Every pilot was trained with gunnery simulators, dive recovery drills, and standardized tactics. Every carrier had a radar-directed combat information center, CIC, that could see hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. The Zero still turned tighter, but that didn't matter anymore. The new American fighters, the F6F Hellcat and F4U Corsair, were faster, stronger, and flown by men who didn't need to fight fair. They fought by vector, by information. In 1942, the Japanese pilot relied on instinct. In 1944, the American relied on mathematics. The myth of the Zero lingered long after its reality had burned away. Even Japanese pilots knew it. In one training manual written in late 1943, a senior instructor warned, "Do not expect the enemy to fight as he did in the Solomons. He now sees you before you see him." That sentence captured the turning point. The Americans had built an invisible weapon, radar, and trained an entire generation of pilots to use it. The Japanese still believed that spirit could overcome steel. The Americans built a system that didn't care about spirit. By 1944, the A6M50 could still roll, still climb, still fight. But every advantage it once had was gone. Its agility no longer mattered because it never got close enough to use it. The Bushido pilot still saw himself as a duelist. The Hellcat pilot saw himself as a node in a network, one signal among hundreds, moving in perfect synchronization. And in that difference, between instinct and integration, lay the death of the Zero's myth. When Japanese pilots took off from their carriers in June 1944, they believed they were fighting men. They were actually fighting math. War in the air is a contest between two kinds of genius, the pilot's skill and the engineer's system. In the Pacific, one side believed in the first. The other built the second. Bethpage, Long Island, 1943. Inside the Grumman aircraft engineering plant, 12,000 workers swarm over aluminum skeletons. Men in oil-stained overalls rivet, weld, and assemble F6F Hellcats on endless moving lines. The sound is deafening. Pneumatic drills, steel on steel, and the unbroken hum of a nation turning resources into dominance. Grumman's engineers called it the Iron Works. Every plane built here had a soul of steel and a heart of redundancy. The F6F was designed not as a masterpiece, but as a tool, rugged, forgiving, modular. If a rookie could fly it, it could win the war. Every week, Long Island sent 100 Hellcats across the Atlantic to San Diego, then west to the Pacific. Each one had the same DNA, Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower of mechanical fury, 6 50-caliber Browning M2s, 400 rounds per gun, self-sealing tanks, armored cockpit, and bulletproof glass canopy. A design philosophy summed up by Grumman's chief engineer, Leroy Grumman. If a pilot can't bring it home with 2 holes, he'll bring it home with 4. Across the Pacific, Japan was fighting a different war. Kawanishi and Mitsubishi factories, 1943. Bombs had already fallen near Yokosuka. Materials were scarce. Factories worked by candlelight. The workforce was shrinking. Veterans replaced by teenage girls, apprentices, and conscripted students. Japan still produced aircraft, but not enough pilots to fly them. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators trained for 5 years before entering combat. By 1943, the program was cut to 9 months. By 1944, it was barely 4. The Imperial Navy still worshipped the Zero, its perfect turn rate, its feather-light frame, but perfection had become a liability. Each one required precision craftsmanship, hand-fitted rivets, and rare materials like duralumin and high-octane fuel Japan could no longer afford. The Hellcat, by contrast, was built for replication. It didn't need master craftsmen. It needed foremen. It didn't need devotion. It needed torque wrenches. By late 1943, the difference could be seen from orbit. America was producing 500 Hellcats a month. Japan, barely 80 Zeros. It wasn't just about quantity, it was about philosophy. Japan believed that war was an art, that a single pilot, properly trained, could offset any numerical disadvantage. The Americans believed that war was an equation, a process that could be learned, scaled, and perfected. The Hellcat was proof of that equation. It was built to be flown, fought, and fixed by ordinary men. A Japanese ace might need 2,000 hours of flight time to reach mastery. An American could become combat-ready in 300, and the Hellcat forgave the other 1,700 hours he didn't have. Grumman's test pilots described it as an airplane that wants to live. It could take hits from 20mm shells, lose a cylinder, lose hydraulics, lose an aileron, and still fly home. The Zero could not. When American intelligence examined the wrecks of Japanese aircraft, the difference was visceral. Where the Hellcat used thick armor plate, the Zero used paper-thin aluminum. Where the Hellcat's control cables were doubled, the Zeros were single-threaded. Every decision Japan made favored offense, assuming the pilot would never be hit. Every decision America made favored survival, assuming the pilot would. Behind those design philosophies were 2 economies, 2 cultures, and 2 futures. At the Naval Air Station in Pearl Harbor, Hellcat pilots trained using radar intercept drills, ground control vectoring, and simulated carrier defense scenarios. At Tsukuba Air Base, Japanese instructors lectured new recruits on the spirit of Yamato, courage, loyalty, and death before dishonor. The results were inevitable. When those 2 systems finally met over the Marianas, the Hellcat didn't just fight the Zero. It erased its logic. Radar told the Hellcat where to climb. Armor let it survive the first burst. Firepower let it end the fight in seconds. Every part of the system reinforced every other. By 1944, the war in the air was no longer a duel between men. It was a test between industrial processes. Japan was fighting with swords on a battlefield of algorithms. A pilot like Saburo Sakai, who had once shot down 30 planes in the Solomons, now found himself outnumbered 10-1, guided into ambushes he couldn't see, and flying an aircraft that couldn't dive fast enough to escape. He called it like being hunted by ghosts. Those ghosts had names: Hellcat, Corsair, Radar, CIC, and Industry. In the Pacific, production lines had become predators. Every warplane tells its own truth in numbers. And the F6F Hellcat's truth wasn't beauty or elegance, it was math, ruthless, repeatable math. By 1944, the U.S. Navy's fleet fighter wasn't the fastest plane in the Pacific. It wasn't the most maneuverable. It wasn't even the most feared at first. But the Hellcat was designed around a single formula. Power x protection x predictability equals survival. Each piece of data was a bullet point in that formula. Engine: Pratt & Whitney R2800-10W Double Wasp. A 2,000 horsepower, 18-cylinder beast that could climb 12,000 feet per minute, punch through tropical storms, and take a direct hit from shrapnel without losing a cylinder. It burned through 200 gallons per hour and didn't care. Speed: 380 mph in level flight, 420 in a dive. The Zero could barely reach 340. That meant a Hellcat pilot could choose when to fight, when to flee, and when to dictate the vertical, the single most decisive advantage in aerial combat. Armor: 212 pounds of cockpit plating plus bulletproof glass and self-sealing tanks. The Zero carried none of that. It traded protection for agility, a fatal mistake in a war of attrition. Firepower: 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, synchronized for convergence at 250 yards. Each gun fired 850 rounds per minute. That's 8,000 rounds of 50 caliber per Hellcat per minute, each round capable of punching through a Zero's engine block. Multiply that by a combat air patrol of 40 Hellcats, over 300,000 bullets in 60 seconds. The Japanese called them steel storms. Range: 1,090 miles with drop tanks. That gave the Navy's fighters endurance equal to or greater than Japan's long-legged Zeros. The old myth that the Zero could outlast its enemies evaporated. But the true killer stat wasn't hardware. It was coordination. Radar detection range by 1944: 140 miles. Fleet combat information centers could track, classify, and vector Hellcat squadrons to intercept positions using radio commands in real time. Each CIC tracked bearing, altitude, and closure speed, guiding pilots to ambush the enemy before they were even visible. It was the death of chance. In 1942, Japan fought wars of instinct. In 1944, the U.S. Navy fought wars of prediction. Every Hellcat launch was a pre-calculated kill zone. Aboard the carriers, radar plots looked like chessboards, each contact labeled, tracked, and assigned an intercept pair. Pilots didn't hunt blindly. They arrived in the right place at the right time, every time. When American statisticians analyzed results from the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the numbers broke belief. 373 Japanese planes destroyed in one day. Hellcats lost in air combat, 29. That's a 12.8-to-1 kill ratio, and that's the average. Across the entire Pacific War, the ratio would rise to 19-1-1. For every Hellcat lost, 19 Japanese aircraft fell. But the deeper number, the one that truly broke the Imperial Navy, was pilot survival. The average Japanese naval aviator in 1944 had a 1 in 4 chance of surviving a single mission. The average American Hellcat pilot had an 85% chance of surviving the entire war. That's not luck. That's logistics turned into armor. Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats in just 2 years, a number so staggering that the Navy sometimes ran out of space to store them. Each one was a product of lessons learned in blood. The weaknesses of the F4F Wildcat, the horrors of Guadalcanal, the fragility of early radar. All corrected, all refined. Meanwhile, Japan's aircraft numbers fell off a cliff. 1942, 8,000 aircraft built. 1944, barely 4,000. Pilot production dropped by 60%. You can't fight air wars with equations like that. The Zero's formula, lightness plus pilot skill, had been overtaken by time. Even Japan's new fighters, the A6N5C and N1K2J Shiden, couldn't fix the fundamentals. They were brilliant aircraft flown by men who had never seen combat before. The Hellcat didn't just kill aircraft. It killed systems, radar, industry, and doctrine included. In the summer of 1944, Japanese pilots described the sky as a sea of invisible traps. Radar-guided interceptions left them disoriented and outnumbered before they could even see their enemies. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, the U.S. Navy's top ace, said it best. "They came into range already defeated. We just gave physics the final push." Physics and mass production. The Zero had been born in secrecy, nurtured by artisans. The Hellcat was born in daylight, stamped by machines and delivered in bulk. The difference was the future itself. The numbers weren't glamorous, they weren't romantic, but they didn't need to be, because numbers end illusions. And by 1944, the illusion of Japanese air supremacy had burned out under the relentless arithmetic of the Hellcat. The Hellcat's first trial by fire came not in the grand battles of the Philippine Sea, but over two small, blood-soaked specks of coral, Tarawa and Makin Atoll, November 1943. Until then, the F6F was still a rumor. The Zero still haunted American memory, the sleek, silent killer from Pearl Harbor and the Solomons. Few U.S. pilots had even seen a Hellcat in combat, and none yet knew if it could survive against Japan's most seasoned veterans. That changed on November 20th, 1943. As the U.S. Marines stormed Tarawa's lagoon, waves of Japanese aircraft took off from nearby bases in the Marshalls, intent on smashing the invasion fleet. Aboard the carriers USS Essex, USS Bunker Hill, and USS Yorktown, the first operational Hellcat squadrons, VF-9, VF-16, and VF-5, waited. Radar picked up the incoming formations before any man could see them. Controllers aboard the carriers vectored their fighters into intercept positions with cold precision. Bandits approaching, bearing 215, Angels 15, range 70 miles. The Hellcats launched in pairs, climbing through a blazing sunrise. In their cockpits were pilots like Lieutenant Seamander Edward Butch O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient, and Lieutenant Seamander David McCampbell, still months away from becoming the Navy's top ace. Most of them had never fired their guns in anger. They were about to rewrite the Pacific's playbook. At 20,000 feet, the Hellcats leveled off, big, square-shouldered beasts of steel and horsepower. Below, the enemy formation shimmered, A6M Zeros and D3A Val dive bombers, escorted by veteran pilots from Rabaul. But this time, it wasn't a fair fight. The Americans saw the enemy first. Radar had given them the high ground before the battle even began. McCampbell's wingman called the first contact. "Bandits, 10 o'clock low." The Hellcats rolled, inverted, and dove. 650 caliber Brownings tore the dawn apart. Zeros disintegrated mid-turn, their fuel tanks erupting into fireballs. Dive bombers tumbled like broken glass. The Japanese formation collapsed in minutes. When the smoke cleared, 28 enemy aircraft lay burning or sinking, for the loss of 2 Hellcats. 2. The report stunned both navies. U.S. intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor initially refused to believe the kill ratio. They ordered multiple cross-checks with gun camera footage. The footage didn't lie. The Hellcat had passed its baptism, and it had done so not through luck or spirit, but through information. Radar had given the Americans the element of surprise. The plane's brute speed and firepower had done the rest. Japanese survivors of that battle later wrote of their shock. One pilot, Ensign Matsuo Sato, described being attacked from above, from behind, from nowhere. He never saw a single American face. He called it fighting ghosts made of thunder. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had an aircraft that could take the initiative, that could dictate when and how combat occurred. At Tarawa and Macon, that shift was invisible to the men on the beaches, but decisive to the men in the sky. On the ground, Marines fought over 50 yards of sand for 76 hours. Above them, the Hellcats turned the battle's entire outcome. No Japanese reinforcements ever made it through. Every bomber that tried was shot down before reaching the fleet. That was the quiet miracle of the Hellcat. It made survival seem routine. In 1942, Japanese aircraft dictated the rhythm of the Pacific. In 1943, the U.S. Navy flipped the tempo. The Tarawa operation proved that the Hellcats' numbers weren't theoretical. They were lethal. When the carrier groups regrouped afterward, pilots walked the decks in disbelief. The air officers compared logs, tallying kills. The arithmetic looked unreal. 28 enemy aircraft destroyed, 2 Hellcats gone. A 14.1 kill ratio on the first major combat debut. It wasn't a fluke. It was the system working exactly as designed. From that moment, the U.S. Navy trusted the Hellcat completely. Squadrons equipped across the Pacific. Factories doubled production. Training programs standardized every gunnery pattern. Every roll, every radar intercept drill. The Hellcat became a language all pilots could speak. And the Japanese, when still clinging to instinct and improvisation, were now flying in the dark. By the end of 1943, the Imperial Navy had lost nearly 700 aircraft in the Marshalls alone. By the start of 1944, its elite air groups were gone, replaced by hastily trained recruits. The air war had changed forever, and Tarawa was its first proof of concept. Radar had turned surprise into geometry. The Hellcat had turned geometry into destruction. When Japanese survivors were debriefed, one officer wrote bitterly, "They were waiting for us, always waiting. They were not men. They were a machine." He was right. The machine had just switched on. By the dawn of 1944, the Pacific had turned into something entirely new, a sky that could see. For the first time in human history, battle wasn't decided by eyesight, but by electrons. The U.S. Navy's Radar-Directed Combat Air Patrols, SEAP, had fused technology, tactics, and timing into a single lethal equation. The system was elegant, invisible, and absolute. Each carrier in Task Force 58 was its own command center, the heart of a massive neural network stretching hundreds of miles. The Combat Information Center, CIC, buried deep within the ship, was a dark room full of glowing scopes, headsets, and steady voices. Every blip on the screen was a story. Altitude, heading, closure rate, number of bogies. That information didn't sit still. It flowed, outward, upward, and into the air. Destroyer pickets stationed ahead of the carrier line extended the network's reach, their radar antennas spinning through salt haze and heat. They were the tripwires of the Pacific. The instant their screens pulsed, the CIC aboard the carriers had data. Within 60 seconds, the entire fleet did, and that's when the math began. Each contact's course and speed fed into a simple equation. Vector, V, equals, target bearing, plus, closure rate, x time. Controllers turned that into human words over the radio. Hellcat read 3, bogies 300, Angels 20, range 70, turn to 085. It sounded calm, routine, but every syllable was calculated to the second. The result was control, total, invisible control. For the first time, American pilots didn't hunt. They were guided, like arrows fired from a machine. The Japanese never had a chance. Their tactics still depended on visual scouting and radio silence. Their planes lacked reliable long-range radios. Their formation leaders flew until they saw the enemy, which meant by the time they did, the Hellcats were already diving from above. At Kwajalein, the system proved itself beyond theory. January 1944. The Japanese launched 70 aircraft from Roy and Namur to strike the American invasion fleet. Radar picked them up 110 miles out. Controllers calmly vectored 36 Hellcats from VF-10 and VF-9 into intercept. In less than 20 minutes, the Hellcats destroyed 56 enemy aircraft. The fleet never even saw a bomb fall. Rear Admiral Arthur Radford, who oversaw fleet air defense, summed it up bluntly. They never reached us. They never even found us. This was the collapse. The quiet, calculated destruction of the Japanese air arm not through combat, but through displacement. Japan's pilots were still brave, their planes still agile. But they were fighting the wrong kind of war. They were fighting inside a system designed to erase reaction time. The numbers tell the story better than words. In 1942, Japanese raids reached their targets 80% of the time. By mid-1944, fewer than 15% ever did. Of those, less than half dropped bombs before being shot down. That's not just attrition. That's extermination by information. And as the system matured, it got even deadlier. By March 1944, every carrier group in Task Force 58 had radar coordination not just between ships, but between squadrons. If one cap element was low on fuel or ammo, another was already in the air, rotated in before the gap appeared. Hellcats didn't fly blind patrols anymore. They flew in response to real-time data, 360 degrees of coverage, day and night. The Japanese called it the net of the gods. They thought the Americans had discovered some supernatural trick. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. America had learned to mechanize awareness. The Hellcat was its blade. When pilots from Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex tallied their results over the Marianas, the math broke aviation history. 689 enemy aircraft destroyed in 3 months. Losses, 24 Hellcats. That's a 28-to-1 ratio, the highest of the entire war. The Japanese still believed courage could offset imbalance. They called their new recruits Heaven's Eagles. Most had fewer than 100 flight hours. Many couldn't land on a carrier. They were thrown into the sky anyway. Radar saw them. The CIC plotted them. The Hellcats climbed to meet them. And in the empty blue above Saipan and Tinian, the equation played out again and again. Detection plus altitude plus firepower is death. By the time Japanese pilots saw their enemies, it was already over. One Hellcat ace, Lieutenant Alex Vrachu, described it perfectly after shooting down 6 dive bombers in 8 minutes. They were still flying in formation when I opened fire. Not one broke away. They were disciplined. They were doomed. It wasn't arrogance, it was automation. The system worked too well. The Americans had found a way to turn vision into prediction, and prediction had become prophecy. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would only prove what was already obvious. The Zero was obsolete, and Japan's skies belonged to the machine. The war that began with men watching horizons had evolved into one fought by invisible circles on radar screens. The Hellcat didn't just fly through those circles, it completed them. June 19, 1944. The morning air over the Philippine Sea was calm, blue, endless, and deceptively gentle. But below that sky, the last great carrier duel of the Pacific was about to begin. At dawn, Japan's first mobile fleet steamed eastward. 9 carriers, 430 aircraft, and the last of Japan's trained naval aviators. They called it Operation A-Go, the plan to annihilate the U.S. invasion force striking Saipan. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa believed his fleet still held the soul of the Imperial Navy. His air groups had been rebuilt after Truk, filled with fresh pilots who'd sworn to die before retreating. They had practiced endlessly for this moment, the decisive battle to turn the tide. Ozawa didn't know he was flying into a trap 200 miles wide. Task Force 58, 5 carrier groups under Admiral Mark Mitcher had been waiting for this. The Americans didn't need to guess where the enemy was coming from. Radar told them. At 0934 hours, the radar operators aboard USS Lexington picked up the first wave of Japanese aircraft. Large group of bogies, bearing 320 degrees, range 150 miles, altitude 20,000 feet. Combat information centers across the task force came alive. Controllers triangulated bearings, plotted vectors, and radioed squadrons on standby. In less than 10 minutes, 220 F6F Hellcats were airborne. They climbed in pairs, spiraling upward into the sun. The Japanese came in 4 waves, 373 planes in total. Fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers, the last major carrier strike Japan would ever launch. The Americans intercepted the first wave 70 miles from the fleet. The battle didn't unfold like a dogfight. It unfolded like math. Each radar contact became a calculated intercept point. Each intercept became a firing solution. Each firing solution became a kill. Hellcat pilot Lieutenant Alex Vrashu, flying from the USS Lexington, spotted a formation of D-4Y Judy dive bombers lining up for their run. He throttled forward and dove. 6 planes fell in 8 minutes. His gun camera film, still studied today, shows tracers walking up wings, engines detonating, planes bursting into fireballs. Vrashu never even broke a sweat. Another pilot, Ensign Robert Irol, described the scene simply. They came in straight and never fired. They didn't even see us. By the time the first wave reached the fleet, it was already annihilated. The few that broke through found a sky filled with flak and another wall of Hellcats diving from above. The USS South Dakota took 1 hit, the only American ship to be damaged that day. By noon, the sea was burning. Dozens of Japanese aircraft lay scattered across the waves, smoking wrecks bobbing like tombstones. The second and third waves met the same fate. Every time the radar pulsed, new vectors went out. Every time the vectors went out, the Hellcats found their prey. In some squadrons, pilots ran out of ammunition and began ramming their targets or watching helplessly as the last Zeros dove straight into the ocean, their pilots refusing to bail out. Admiral Ozawa's flight leaders reported back in disbelief. Enemy fighters at every altitude. No openings, no escape. By sunset, the battle was effectively over. The results were staggering. Out of 373 Japanese aircraft launched that day, only 35 returned. The Americans lost 29 planes, most to fuel exhaustion, not enemy fire. One naval intelligence officer summarized the outcome in a single line. The Japanese Navy committed suicide over the Marianas. That night, aboard the USS Lexington, pilots gathered on the flight deck, exhausted and exhilarated. They joked about the battle's absurd ease. Someone called it a turkey shoot. The name stuck forever. But behind the humor was something colder. Realization. The Imperial Navy's air arm, once the terror of the Pacific, was gone. The kill ratio that day was 12.8 to 1. Over the entire Marianas campaign, it would rise to 19 to 1. The Japanese had entered the battle with the same faith that carried them since Pearl Harbor, that courage, training, and sacrifice could overcome odds. They left it without an air force. The truth was merciless. The Zeros still turned tighter. The Japanese still flew bravely. But the Hellcat didn't fight duels anymore. It fought data wars. Radar had replaced eyesight. Altitude had replaced instinct. Coordination had replaced courage. And the Zero, that legendary machine of the early war, was now a statistic. After the battle, Admiral Chester Nimitz sent a simple message to Washington. A decisive defeat for the enemy. Our losses light, their losses catastrophic. He was being modest. In 6 hours, the United States had erased the Imperial Navy's air power from the Pacific. The sea below shimmered with oil and flame. The sky above belonged to the machine. The great Marianas Turkey Shoot wasn't a battle. It was an autopsy. The cause of death, believing that skill could outlast systems. October 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy was out of time. Its carriers had no air wings, its pilots no experience, and its fuel tanks almost empty. Yet Tokyo ordered one last gamble, a desperate attempt to strike the American invasion fleet off Leyte Gulf. The operation was called Show 1, Victory Operation. To the men flying into it, it would become a funeral. At dawn on October 12th, the sky over Formosa filled with Japanese aircraft. Fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, everything that could still fly. They came from the home islands, from Okinawa, from Formosa's last functioning airfields. On paper, it was an air fleet of nearly 700 aircraft. In reality, it was a graveyard with wings. Below them, Task Force 38, Mitcher's new fast carriers. Spread across 600 miles of sea, their radar nets, perfected since the Marianas, now stretched farther than ever. Destroyers, cruisers, and escort carriers formed a radar wall so deep that not a single enemy plane could approach unseen. At 0700 hours, the first blips appeared, 180 miles out, bearing north-northwest. CIC controllers aboard the USS Essex and USS Intrepid immediately vectored 3 cap groups to intercept. They never saw the enemy with their eyes. The intercept was purely mathematical. 30 Hellcats climbed to 20,000 feet, throttles wide open. Within minutes, they met the first Japanese formation head-on. Val dive bombers escorted by A6M50s. The battle lasted 12 minutes. 36 Japanese planes shot down. 0 American losses. It went on like that for days. Every dawn, radar picked up new contacts. Every contact became a vector. Every vector became a kill. By nightfall, the seas around Formosa were littered with burning wreckage. Japanese pilots who survived described it as being hunted by invisible hawks. One, Lieutenant Satoru Ono, wrote in his diary before disappearing in combat, "They know we are coming before we leave the ground. It is as if the air itself betrays us." By the end of October 15th, the Japanese had lost over 500 aircraft. Virtually the entire air strength intended to defend the Philippines. Admiral Toyoda Suemu, commanding from Tokyo, wept when the reports arrived. His victory operation had erased the last generation of Japan's trained pilots. The Americans called it simply the Battle of Formosa. It wasn't even recognized as a separate campaign. The loss ratio was too one-sided to qualify as a battle. Then came Leyte Gulf. October 24th, 1944, the largest naval battle in history. Over 200,000 men, 280 warships, and 4 Japanese carrier groups fighting for the soul of the Pacific. But this time, Japan's carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, were decoys. Their decks were nearly empty, their hangars hollow. Only 108 aircraft remained across all 4. When they launched them that morning, most were shot down within an hour. Radar-directed Hellcats from USS Essex, Intrepid, and Enterprise swept the sky clean. The Japanese commanders knew it. The carriers weren't weapons anymore. They were bait. Sacrifices meant to lure the American fleet north so that Japan's remaining battleships could strike the invasion force from the south. It didn't work. Radar ruined the timing. American fleets tracked both Japanese forces simultaneously. The ambush failed before it began. In one day, the U.S. Navy sank or crippled every Japanese carrier still afloat. Zuikaku, the last survivor of Pearl Harbor, went down with her flag still flying. Above the sinking ships, Hellcats circled like metal vultures, cutting down lifeboats, strafing retreating aircraft, and hunting the last desperate torpedo planes trying to make their runs. The kill ratios reached 50-1 in some engagements. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, flying from the Essex, shot down 9 planes in a single mission, the highest one-day total in U.S. Navy history. When his guns finally jammed, he radioed, half laughing, "I'm out of ammo. Send up more targets." By the end of Leyte Gulf, Japan's naval air arm had ceased to exist. Admiral Ozawa's post-battle report listed his carrier force as operationally extinct. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff searched for answers and found only ashes. There would be no new air groups, no new pilots, no new machines. And so the Japanese turned to the unthinkable, the kamikaze. The first suicide strikes began at Leyte. Dozens of inexperienced pilots, flying outdated aircraft filled with fuel and explosives, deliberately crashed into American ships. The attacks shocked the U.S. Navy, not for their damage, but for their desperation. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan had abandoned even the illusion of tactical control. The Zero, once a symbol of dominance, had become a guided bomb. The Hellcat had done more than win air superiority. It had forced Japan to change the definition of war. From now on, it wouldn't be about who could outfly the enemy, but who could die first. Radar had stripped away the human element of surprise. The machine age had stripped away everything else. By the end of 1944, the Pacific skies were a one-sided equation. Hellcats in the air, radars on the sea, and ghosts on the other side of the horizon. The Imperial Navy was dead. It just hadn't hit the water yet. By early 1945, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield. It was a laboratory. The United States had perfected something Japan never could, a war run by mathematics, not mythology. The F6F Hellcat stood at the center of that transformation. It wasn't the fastest plane, it wasn't the prettiest, it wasn't even the deadliest in a single engagement, but it was the most systemic, the physical embodiment of an industrial process that could see, think, and kill faster than any individual pilot. The Japanese called their pilots samurai of the sky. The Americans built a system that didn't need samurai. Every piece of it, radar, radio, training, tactics, production, was a gear in the same machine. The result was not just victory, it was inevitability. The kill ratio tells the story brutally and clearly. 19-1. For every Hellcat shot down in air combat, 19 Japanese planes fell. By war's end, 5,163 enemy aircraft had been destroyed by Hellcat pilots. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived 200 missions, said after the war, "They were not fighting as men, they were fighting as a system." He wasn't wrong. At the start of 1942, Japan ruled the skies through pilot mastery. Men who had trained for years, fought by instinct, and relied on agility and aggression. The Zero's design reflected that worldview. Light, fast, fragile. Perfect for duels, but not for endurance. The Hellcat was the opposite. Its design assumed mistakes. Its systems assumed losses. It turned survivability into doctrine. That's why, even after being hit, a Hellcat could bring its pilot home. A burned, shot-up, oil-leaking engine still able to land on a carrier deck. Japanese planes, by contrast, burned on impact. Their pilots had no second chance. In 1942, the Imperial Navy had 4,000 experienced aviators. By 1945, fewer than 200 remained alive. The rest were dead, missing, or flying kamikaze missions. Every Zero destroyed was more than a plane lost. It was a man Japan couldn't replace. The United States built its pilots like it built its planes, in assembly lines. Every Hellcat pilot learned the same patterns, the same gunnery corrections, the same radio discipline. There was no ace culture, there was procedure, and procedure doesn't panic. When radar calls came in, no one asked where. They already knew. They trusted the system. Japan trusted courage. America trusted coordination. The outcome was decided before the dogfights even began. Even the numbers in production were obscene in their imbalance. 6,477 Hellcats built in 2 years. 3,200 Zeros built in the same period, many flown by trainees. U.S. pilot output, 8,000 per year. Japan, fewer than 1,200. This wasn't a clash of machines. It was a collision between timelines. Japan had built an air force for 1939, when craftsmanship and heroism still mattered. America built one for 1944, when logistics had replaced luck. The myth of the invincible zero was dead. The myth of the individual warrior died with it. The Hellcats' real victory wasn't over aircraft, it was over philosophy. When the Japanese sent their first kamikazes at Leyte, they weren't trying to win. They were trying to make dying matter again. It was a spiritual reaction to a mechanical enemy, the last gasp of Bushido in a world that had turned digital in spirit, if not yet in form. And yet even that failed. Because radar didn't care. The Hellcat didn't hesitate. The system didn't flinch. From the Marianas to Okinawa, every engagement ended the same way. Radar contact, vector call, intercept, kill. The air war had become procedural, predictable, perfectly cold. When Japanese officers studied post-war American records, they were stunned by the data. Every cap launch, every enemy contact, every fuel reading, logged, analyzed, iterated. War had become an algorithm. And the F6F Hellcat was its first hardware. Even Germany's Luftwaffe would later study the Pacific data and conclude, the United States has proven that the modern fighter is not the pilot's weapon, but the fleet's weapon. That was the future of air combat. The Hellcat didn't just kill the Zero. It killed the concept of individual mastery. It proved that in the age of machines, no hero can stand against a network. Japan entered the Pacific War believing that courage could defy odds. America ended it, proving that odds, properly engineered, erase courage. And so, as 1945 dawned, the sky above the Pacific was no longer the realm of knights and aces. It belonged to operators, controllers, and production engineers, men who fought with bearings, equations, and radar scopes. The sword had finally met the assembly line, and the sword broke first. By 1945, the air above the Pacific was silent except for one sound, the deep, rhythmic hum of Hellcats returning home. The Zero was gone, the sky empty. Japan's last squadrons had burned out over Okinawa, their aircraft reduced to kamikaze shells and wreckage drifting in salt spray. The Hellcat hadn't just survived, it had outlasted everything. From its first kills over Tarawa to its last missions over Tokyo Bay, the F6F proved that endurance beats elegance, and information beats instinct. The final tally told the whole story. 19 kills for every loss. The greatest kill ratio in aviation history. But by the time the last carrier landed its planes, the world that built the Hellcat was already ending. In hangars across the US and Japan, engineers were sketching something new, machines without propellers, without mercy, powered by flame instead of pistons. The jet age had begun. The same logic that made the Hellcat unstoppable, radar guidance, predictive control, and production by the thousands, would now leap forward into a new dimension. The F6F had been the last great piston warrior, the king of the analog sky. What came next would make even its 19-1 record look primitive. The P-80 Shooting Star, Me-262, and Gloucester Meteor were already flying. Straight wings, screaming turbines, speed near 600 miles an hour. In that new sky, no amount of armor or radio control could save the slow. The world was entering a race against its own technology, and the finish line would not be peace. Still, for one brief, impossible moment, the Hellcat stood as the purest form of victory. It was a machine built not for perfection, but for persistence. And persistence had reshaped history. It broke an empire. It rewrote the logic of air combat. It turned the romanticism of the ace into a spreadsheet of results. The pilots who flew it didn't see themselves as legends. They saw themselves as parts of something larger, a flying network, a machine made of men and steel. That was its true power. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Hellcats flew over Tokyo Bay as the peace documents were signed aboard the USS Missouri. Below them, the same radar that once guided them to battle now guided ships into harbor. The machine had won. In a war that began with intuition and ended with algorithms, the F6F Hellcat was the bridge from the age of heroes to the age of systems. Because in modern war, the deadliest weapon isn't courage or craftsmanship, it's coordination. And the Hellcat was coordination with wings. The Japanese pilots who once mocked American machines never understood what they were really fighting. They weren't fighting aircraft. They were fighting process. And process doesn't die.